The old farmhouse on State Route 3022, just outside of Cambridge, Ohio, had been a bargain, a fact Leo now considered with a grim, cold irony that settled deep in his bones. It was late, past 2:00 a.m. on Halloween night, and the silence of the rural countryside was not peaceful, but profound and heavy, a thick blanket smothering the world. He had been reading in bed, a single lamp casting a weak, yellow pool of light onto the pages, when the familiar, comforting sounds of the house, the groan of settling timber, the hum of the refrigerator, ceased entirely, as if a switch had been thrown. The air grew still and cold, a damp chill that seeped through the quilt and gnawed at his skin. It was this drop in temperature that first pulled his attention from his book. He looked up, not toward the door, but instinctively toward the far corner of the room, the one deepest in shadow, beyond the reach of the lamplight. At first, he saw only the familiar shapes of the room, the bulky form of his oak wardrobe, the faint glint of the window pane. But then, a shape within the shadows began to distinguish itself, a darkness that was denser and more defined than the space around it. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and unnaturally thin, its form seeming to absorb the scant light rather than reflect it. Leo's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful hitch. His rational mind scrambled for an explanation. A trick of the light, a coat thrown over a chair, the lingering fatigue from a long week. But the shape had a presence, a tangible weight in the room that pressed against his eardrums. He lay perfectly still, the only movement the frantic hammering of his heart against his ribs. He tried to call out, to demand who was there, but his vocal cords were frozen, paralyzed by a primal fear that was older than reason. The thing in the corner did not move. It simply stood, a silent, vertical void, observing him from a face that had no eyes. Time stretched and distorted. It could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes. Leo's eyes, now fully adjusted to the gloom, began to pick out details that his mind desperately tried to reject. The surface of the creature was not simply black. It was a shifting, granular texture, like television static made solid, or the chitinous shell of a massive insect. It had limbs, too long and too thin, that ended not in hands but in tapering points. And then, the most terrifying detail of all, it began to lean forward. It did not bend at the waist or knees. Its entire rigid body tilted toward the bed, like a felled tree beginning its descent, a slow, deliberate motion that was utterly silent. A sound finally broke the silence, a dry, rustling scrape, like bundles of dead leaves being dragged across the floorboards. It was the sound of the creature taking a step. It moved with that same impossible, tilted posture. Gliding more than walking, it was coming toward the bed. Leo's paralysis shattered. A surge of raw adrenaline flooded his system. He threw himself sideways, tumbling off the far side of the bed, and onto the cold floor with a jarring thud. He scrambled backward on his hands and heels, his eyes locked on the approaching form. Not daring to look away, he backed himself into the corner by the bedroom door, his body trembling uncontrollably. The creature reached the side of the bed he had just vacated. It stopped. Its featureless head seemed to survey the empty, rumpled sheets for a moment. Then, with that same slow, deliberate motion, it began to turn its head toward Leo's new position in the corner. It was in that moment, trapped and completely exposed, that Leo knew with absolute certainty that this was not a dream, not a hallucination. This was a real thing, a predator in his bedroom, and it was now fully aware of him. The creature took another step, then another, closing the distance between them. The rustling, scraping sound filled the small room. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, pressing himself into the wall as if he could phase through the plaster and laugh. He could feel the cold emanating from the thing, a deep, soul-sucking chill. He could smell it now, a faint odor of ozone and damp, rich earth, like a freshly opened grave. It was right in front of him. He held his breath, waiting for the touch of those pointed limbs for the end. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The cold receded. The faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator kicked back on in the kitchen below. Leo dared to open his eyes. The corner was empty. The bedroom was empty. He sat there for a long time, his body shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The first gray light of a Halloween dawn was beginning to filter through the window when he finally found the strength to move. He never slept in that room again. He told people in Cambridge a sanitized version of the story, and they nodded politely, attributing it to stress or an overactive imagination. But Leo knew what he had seen in the corner of his bedroom on State Route 3022. He knew it was real, and he knew, with a dread that never left him, that it had seen him, too. The last house on Hemlock Drive was always the best. That's what everyone in the quiet suburb of Dublin, Ohio said. Old Mr. Abernathy didn't just give out fistfuls of the good chocolate. He transformed his property into a local legend. His front yard was a masterclass in Halloween spectacle, a labyrinth of animated skeletons, fog machines that cloaked the grass in a low, chilly blanket, and speakers that played a continuous, low-volume symphony of moans and creaking doors. This year, the centerpiece was a massive, pneumatic spider that lunged from a giant, synthetic web strung between two ancient oak trees. The air smelled of decaying leaves, damp earth, and the sweet, waxy scent of lit jack-o'-lanterns, their carved grins flickering in the darkness. Lena and her younger brother Ben were making their final approach, their pillowcases already heavy with loot. They had started on the newer developments off Avery Road, with their wide, well-lit sidewalks, and were now working their way through the older, more established neighborhoods where the trees canopied the streets and the houses held a more genuine, weathered eeriness. Ben, dressed as a pirate with a plastic sword, was practically vibrating with excitement. Lena, at 14, felt she was getting too old for this, but she'd promised him. She pulled her witch's cloak tighter against the biting wind that rustled the dry cornstalks, tied to Mr. Abernathy's lamppost. The line to get to the front door snaked past a graveyard of styrofoam tombstones. When it was finally their turn, Mr. Abernathy wasn't the jovial, elderly man Lena remembered from last year, handing out full-size Snickers bars with a chuckle. The door was opened by a tall, silent figure. He wore a long, dark coat that smelled faintly of gasoline and damp soil. But it was the face, or the lack of it, that made Lena's breath catch in her throat. It was a mask, but unlike any she had ever seen. It wasn't plastic or latex, it looked organic. It was constructed from pieces of different colored leathers, stitched together like a Frankensteinian quilt. One section was a pale, almost waxy hide, another a swatch of darker, rougher texture. The stitches were thick and black, crisscrossing the surface like scars. The mouth was a simple slit, but glued just below it was a single, yellowing human tooth. The man didn't speak. He simply gestured with a gloved hand for them to come inside. Ben, oblivious in his sugar-fueled euphoria, started to step across the threshold. Lena grabbed his arm. "We're good out here, thanks," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. The smiling man, a name she didn't know but felt in her marrow, tilted his head. The mask's empty eye holes seemed to fix on her. He then reached into a burlap sack at his feet and pulled out 2 apples. They were a deep, polished red, perfect and inviting. He held them out. It was a trick, a classic, simple trick. But the context made it feel like a threat. Ben, thinking it was part of the show, took his. Reluctantly, Lena took the other, her fingers brushing against the cold, waxy skin of the fruit. The man then slowly closed the door, leaving them standing in the chilly air, the pneumatic spider hissing behind them. Later that night, after their parents had inspected their candy with a bored familiarity and they were tucked in bed, Lena couldn't sleep. The image of that mask was burned onto the back of her eyelids. She got up and went to her desk, where she had dumped her pillowcase. On top of the pile of candy was the perfect red apple. It looked so out of place, so deceptively simple. Driven by a dread she couldn't explain, she found a knife from the kitchen and brought it back to her room. She didn't slice the apple neatly. She brought the knife down hard, splitting it open with a wet crack. The core was exposed, the seeds dark against the white flesh. And there, nestled among them, was a tiny, tightly rolled scroll of paper, the kind used for ancient documents. It was tied with a single strand of black thread. Her hands trembled as she untied the thread and unrolled the scroll. The paper was brittle, the edges frayed. The message was written in a cramped, precise script, the ink a rusty brown. Your brother's tooth will be the star of next year's smile. The harvest continues. SM. The world dropped out from under Lena. This wasn't a prank. The smell of the man's coat, the grotesque mask, the single tooth, it all clicked into a horrifying mosaic. The treat wasn't the apple. It was the warning. The trick was what was to come. He wasn't just wearing a mask, he was collecting materials for the next one. And he had just announced his next component. She looked down the hall towards Ben's room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't wake her parents. What would she say? They'd think it was a sick joke, a Halloween story gone too far. Instead, she crept to the front window and peered through the blinds into the night. Their street, Shadowmere Lane, was quiet, slick with a recent, light rain. The decorations looked sad and deflated in the aftermath of the holiday. And then she saw it. Parked under the weeping willow tree 3 houses down was a dark van. It hadn't been there an hour ago. It was just sitting there, engine off, lights dead. The streetlight glinted off its rain-beaded surface. She couldn't see inside the windshield, it was just a black void. She knew, with a certainty that turned her blood to ice, that he was in there. The smiling man, waiting, watching her house. Waiting for the lights to go out, for the world to fall asleep. To begin his harvest. Lena backed away from the window, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She moved through the dark house, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a thunderclap. The digital clock in the living room glowed 3:03 a.m. The world was at its deepest, most vulnerable point. She went into the kitchen and stood before the knife block on the counter. Her reflection in the dark window over the sink was a pale, wide-eyed ghost. Her hand hovered over the wooden handles. She selected the largest one, a chef's knife her mother used to chop vegetables. The weight of it in her hand was alien and terrifying. She wasn't a child playing witch anymore. The threat was real, it was outside, and it wanted a piece of her brother. She didn't turn on any lights. She sat on the bottom step of the staircase in the foyer, the cold wood of the step seeping through her pajamas. From here, she could see both the front door, with its sturdy deadbolt and chain she had silently fastened, and down the hall to the sliver of light coming from Ben's slightly open door. The house was a tomb, silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of her own heart. She clutched the knife, her palms slick with sweat. She listened for the sound of an engine starting, for the soft crunch of a footstep on the wet gravel of the driveway, for the faintest click of a lock being tested. The note had said, "Next year's smile," but the van outside suggested the harvest might be tonight. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, a gray, pre-dawn light was filtering through the narrow window beside the door. The knife was still in her lap. Her body was stiff and cold. She scrambled to the window, her heart in her throat, and looked out. The street was empty. The van was gone. There was only an oily stain on the asphalt where it had been parked. A wave of dizzying relief washed over her, so potent it made her nauseous. He was gone. For now. She looked at the note, still on her desk next to the mutilated apple. SM, the smiling man, he was real, he was out there, and he had a long, dark year to plan. Lena knew with a chilling certainty that next Halloween, the door she knocked on might just be his again, and the mask he wore would be a little more complete, its grotesque tapestry waiting for its new shining star. My name is Ben, and the memory of what happened last October in Portland is a cold weight in my chest that never fully goes away. I was house-sitting for my aunt in the Irvington neighborhood, a place known for its manicured lawns, wide, quiet streets, and families who treat Halloween as a serious event. The night started with a deceptive normalcy. I had stocked up on full-sized candy bars from the Fred Meyer on Broadway, a horror movie marathon playing on the large television, and a steady, cheerful stream of adorable ghosts, superheroes, and witches coming to the door. The air smelled of damp leaves, candle wax, and cheap perfume. By 8:30 p.m. the younger trick-or-treaters had been replaced by older kids in less elaborate costumes, and the stream had dwindled to a trickle, leaving behind the quiet patter of rain on the roof, and the occasional rustle of a breeze through the massive, ancient maple tree in the front yard. I was gathering the remote controls, about to turn off the porch light and call it a night, when a flicker of motion caught my eye. Across the street, under the jaundiced glow of the sodium vapor street lamp, stood a group of 5 figures. They were arranged in a loose semicircle and were utterly motionless, as if they had been planted there. All were clad in garish, mismatched clown costumes that looked both antique and meticulously maintained. One wore polka-dotted overalls over a ruffled blood-orange shirt with enormous, floppy green shoes. Another wore a tattered Victorian-era suit in a faded, dusty purple with a tall, dented top hat perched at a precarious angle. Their faces were hidden behind grotesque, professional-grade masks of porcelain or fine latex with fixed, maniacal grins, exaggerated cheekbones, and deeply shadowed eye sockets that seemed to absorb the light. They didn't speak. They didn't gesture, they just stood in the rain, perfectly still, their hidden gazes seeming to scan the houses like predators. A cold knot tightened in my stomach, a primal warning. It was deeply unsettling, but I clung to rationality, writing it off as an extreme, performance art-style Halloween prank. I locked the deadbolt on the front door, the solid thunk doing little to settle my nerves. I returned to the couch but found I could no longer follow the plot of the movie. The silence from outside felt heavy, expectant, a held breath. After about 10 minutes, I heard it. The first sound that broke the illusion of a normal night. It wasn't a laugh or a shout, but a low, discordant, and wet-sounding blast from a cheap plastic trumpet, the kind a circus clown might use. It was followed by another from a different direction than the rhythmic, maddening clatter of what sounded like 24 wooden sticks being beaten against metal garbage can lids and aluminum siding. The cacophony wasn't random, it had a rhythm, a purposefully jarring and aggressive cadence that felt like a war chant. I crept back to the window, keeping to the shadows, and peered out through a gap in the curtains. The street was no longer quiet. More clowns had emerged from the shadows between houses, from the alleyways that ran behind the properties. They moved in a jerky, unnerving procession. Some on rickety stilts that clacked on the pavement, others bouncing on oversized spring-loaded shoes that emitted a sickening bowing with each jarring landing. My phone buzzed violently on the coffee table, an emergency alert stark on the screen. Avoid all areas of unrest. Multiple reports of coordinated, armed disturbances citywide. Await further instructions. The word armed sent a new, different kind of chill through me. Then my phone began to vibrate continuously, a torrent of texts from friends. A buddy in St. John's sent a blurry video of a dozen clowns silently swinging crowbars at the windows of a bar on Lombard Avenue. A friend in Hawthorne reported a swarm of them pouring out of vans on SE 34th, methodically slashing the tires of every car on the block. Another, from Laurelhurst, texted about them using black spray paint to mark symbols, a laughing face with a single black tear, on the doors of specific houses they passed. They weren't robbing. They weren't taking anything. This was not looting in any traditional sense. They were dismantling. They were erasing the peaceful normalcy of the night and replacing it with their own violent, chaotic carnival, a perverted harvest. The cacophony outside swelled, moving closer until it felt like it was right in my front yard. It was a symphony of air horns, kazoos, jangling bells, and the constant, punctuating crunch of shattering glass. I killed all the lights in the house, plunging myself into total darkness, and crawled on my hands and knees to the upstairs hallway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could hear their footsteps on my street now, a shuffling, scraping sound of multiple textures, rubber soles, leather, the drag of fabric, mixed with the squeak of synthetic materials and the relentless jingle of bells. I heard the distinct, metallic squeal of my own front gate being swung open and hitting the fence with a soft, definitive thud. I didn't dare look. I just pressed my forehead against the cool wall and listened. The sound of their breathing was a wet, collective wheeze, a dissonant harmony of inhalations and exhalations just beyond the thin wood of the front door. Then, a single, long, slow, deliberate scrape of something unyieldingly metal, a blade, a sharpened tool, was dragged across the entire width of the door. It was a sound I felt in my teeth and in the bones of my skull, a promise of violation. They moved on after an eternity, their horrible music and the sounds of their destruction fading slowly down the block towards Broadway. I stayed frozen in the hallway for a long time, until the only sounds were the distant, overlapping wails of countless sirens converging from all over the city, and the relentless, steady hiss of the rain. When the sun finally rose, a gray and weak light bleeding through the clouds, I ventured outside on trembling legs. My street, and every street I could see, looked like a war zone. Toilet paper and silly string were draped over everything like ghastly, synthetic cobwebs. Windows were broken, not just smashed, but carefully, patternistically fractured. Cars were dented and keyed with those same laughing face symbols. My own front door was untouched, except for a single, child-sized handprint in what looked like red grease paint, right at the center. At waist, level fingers perfectly defined. The city cleanup took weeks. The official story, repeated on the news for days, was a massive, copycat prank gone wrong, fueled by social media and general unrest. No arrests were ever made. No group, no manifesto, no demands ever emerged. But those of us who were there, who heard that calculated cacophony and witnessed the organized, silent precision of their chaos, we know it was something else entirely. It was an unmasking. It was a ritual. And we all know, with a cold, stone, in the gut certainty that keeps us from sleeping soundly every night as October wanes, that the carnival is still out there, waiting in the shadows, counting the days until the next Halloween when the gates are opened once more.